Barakallahu feek. Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, I'd refer also anyone watching to your Hastunist video from this time last year, which has a quick gallop through the new edition of Sheikh Obak's book. But that's me sort of commenting as I gallop through the book, rather sort of breathlessly. But I've tried to sort of do it in a more sensible way this time round. I'm actually going to follow Sheikh Obak's own text, and I'm just sort of culling little things that he's said, and I've tried to match up images to sort of coincide with what he's saying. But there's much that I might have loved to have indulged you with this time, which I think I'll try and restrain myself from talking to you about, because you'll be able to find that on the video from last year. So let me just sort of read as I'm going. So the first little section I wanted to talk to you about is the idea of sacred art. And so Sheikh Obak points out that the Quran is word-made book, as compared to Christianity, where one talks of Christ made flesh. And he talks about the idea of, some people sometimes mistake the idea of what sacred art is. It's not necessarily art that revolves around a religious subject. Sacred art has its own very sort of, well, let me quote Sheikh Obak. Sacred art is dominated and penetrated by its own transcendent archetype. And Frithjof Schuon, who was Sheikh Obak's sheikh, he quotes him saying, "The presence of sacred art is one of the criteria of authenticity of a religion." So in fact, it's rather wonderful, one can quote Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam in the Gospels, who says, "You shall know them by their fruit," or their fruits. I mean, the image that we're looking at in front of us is simply dropped from heaven in a certain sense, and this could never have been, it could never have come about through a sort of a human endeavor that was cut off from the divine. Sacred art has a function parallel to that of revelation, itself as a means of causing repercussions in the human soul in the direction of the transcendent. So when one's in the presence of sacred art, one has this, sacred art has this function to draw us back to one's origin. It is seldom, however, contemporary with the initial impact of the religion, and it is thus able to compensate for certain losses, above all as a means of expressing to later generations something of what the presence of the messenger expressed in the first generation. So it's a wonderful thing to see the sacred art as sort of compensation. I remember elsewhere, Sheikh Obak has spoken of how a civilization is like the unfolding of a seed that is the original messenger of any given dispensation. And Sheikh Obak has this wonderful little phrase that he mentions in this context: to compensate for an absence is to be a prolongation of a presence. I think that's such a wonderful Martin Lings-ish kind of English sentence that I think only he could have come up with. Among the divine names we find the beautiful, Al-Jamil, the creator, the former, the marvelously original, and the all-holy. And here lies the metaphysical inevitability of sacred art as a result of revelation. Here also lie the roots of all artistic genius, and it is only from these roots that a tradition of sacred art can spring. A tradition which will eventually enable less gifted artists to participate in the consecrated genius of others and to excel themselves beyond all measure. Whence the connection between sacred art and the traditional arts and crafts. I think it's a wonderful point that Sheikh Abay draws out, because one thinks, well, surely sacred art, not every artist that sits down to produce a Quran as is at the level of his inspiration as the next artist. And in a certain sense, Sheikh Abay points out that these great gifts or models come through certain very gifted individuals, and then they get distributed and fed into the community, and they're copied and passed down with certain sort of rules, which certain in a certain way guarantee the efficacy of the art in question. Again, to quote from Sheikh Abu Bakr, there is always the possibility that the known artist worked under the influence of an unknown visionary, and there may be more than one generation between the perfecter of any given style and the man who received the initial spiritual impetus. Sacred art is always strikingly impersonal through its transcendence of the individual. And in fact, Sheikh Abay points out that quite often you find the great works of sacred art are unsigned. It's almost as if the person who produced them was saying, well, it's not me who's the author here. I'm just the recipient of a gift. So turning to the idea of illumination, illumination developed more slowly than calligraphy itself. And Sheikh Abay gives two reasons. The first, it was not directly called for by the text. And it was held in check by the fear of allowing anything to intrude upon the text. So for instance, at the page that we're looking at, in a certain sense, the Quran doesn't ask for a tree symbol to be painted here. And in fact, even the surah headings, I'm not sure if they're even considered strictly as if they're part of the text as such. But of course, these little elements did come in. And for instance, you'll see a little golden, or it's a ha symbol at the end of the last word. And that's a little sort of indicator to say this is the end of 5 verses that have been counted from previous verses. So all of these little extra details which are added in were sort of were put in with great care and sort of trepidation almost. Sheikh Abay talks about a reverential awe. In Arabic, that's hayba. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. To quote Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam, Ra'sul hikmah makhafatullah. The Quran itself may be said to hold out certain opportunities, as it were, in the invitation to the illuminator. So let me just come down here to look at this other page. Firstly, there's the opportunity provided by surah headings, as you can see here on the top left, what the artists have made for it in future. And then there's the division between verses. So you see the little shamsas here that are indicating where one verse ends and the next verse. And then also there's the opportunity of indicating multiples of 5 verses, so you can find your way through the text easily. If you see on the margin on the top right, that circular roundel expresses that 10 or a multiple of 10 verses has passed. So you can count using the shamsas, the little shamsas in the text, and these roundels on the outside. Sometimes, of course, the roundel on the outside is also in the shape of a ha, which indicates the passing of 5 verses. Then the other opportunity, of course, for illumination comes with indicating a place where you might have to make sajda as you're reading the text. And there's a very beautiful little element here. You can see in the bottom right. And it's almost the illuminator is very beautiful. He's written the word sajda in its own little mosque facing to its own little qibla. Of course, and then there's the opening of the first surah, of course, would also gives ample opportunities for illustrations. But the thing to remember is that the Quran is universally acknowledged as being in Islam it's uncreated, and so it conveys the divine presence. How cope with or deal with trying to make to convey this presence through his sort of formal work. If you look at this, this is the end of a wonderful mushaf in 30 volumes produced for Sultan al-Jaytu in the it was produced at the end of the 13th century, the beginning, yes, end of the 13th century. There's the Surat Ikhlas at the top on the right-hand side. Just Sheikh Hoback points out that the word Ahad, al-Ahad, can be translated the indivisible, one and only, and as-Samad, the totally sufficing unto himself in his infinite perfection. So infinitude and perfection, Kamal, are definitions of the absolute. And of course, the absolute is dealt with by all religions. But in the Islamic world, Islam, as Sheikh White points out, has an unwillingness to leave this highest metaphysical plane, except in passing and on condition of reverting as soon as possible from the relative to the absolute. He is the first and the last, and the outward and the inward. And sacred art, in a sense, depends on the name, the outward. Yet since the one is indivisible, is always one with the inwardness. I think it's wonderful the way Sheikh Hoback explains that to us. It is a function of sacred art in general to be a vehicle for the divine presence. Islam is particularly averse to any idea of circumscribing or localizing the divine, or limiting it in any way. Now, the first sacred art for man, the first earthly vehicle of the divine presence, is nature itself. And it is moreover the Quran which draws the artist's attention to this primordial solution. So here, of course, we have the image of the tree. And the Quran uses this very symbol of itself. A good word is as a good tree, its root firm, its branches in heaven, giving its fruits at every due season by the leave of its Lord. And God coineth similitudes for men, that they may remember. And Sheikh Hoback points out that this last part of the verse is very critical, that God coineth similitudes for men, that they may remember. So remembering is a process of being drawn back. I mean, the Quran draws us back through its sacred art. We need not therefore be surprised that one of the most fundamental ornaments of Quran illumination should be arboreal, namely the palmet or the shujaira, which means a little tree. Nor need we doubt that it is meant to stand for the good word. Of course, here's another example of the same tree stylized. The surah heading here is prolonged into the outer margin as in the previous example, by means of a palmette, which points horizontally to the paper's edge and which achieves for the eye the effect of a liberation of incalculable scope. So here again, you see the stylized tree. And once again, you see it here. If you notice this tree here with its finial, that you can see the very tip of this finial of the tree has been clipped off. And Sheikh Rabi says a wonderful footnote here. He says, the importance of this ornament is tragically demonstrated whenever, as is all too often the case, a binder in trimming the pages of an old manuscript has trimmed away the lobes of the palmette. How little has been lost, and yet how much. In fact, Sheikh Rabi, where do we talk? Just to jump ahead to what I'll mention later, of course, the margin represents heaven. You know, the tree has its branches in heaven. So the symbolism of the margin is heaven itself. And so when you have this tiny little detail clipped off, it's almost as if that impetus to return back to heaven is almost sort of curtailed. So that's why how much is lost. The tree places emphasis on ascent, but the Quran emphasizes both ascent and descent, talking of the tanzil, ascending down. The Islamic artist, therefore, must capture three things. Firstly, the Quran as a descending power of revelation, and then the Quran as a mysterious presence of the infinite in the finite. And then thirdly, the Quran as an ascending power of reintegration. The tree as we experience it, a symbol of these second two, the mysterious presence of the infinite in the finite and the ascending power of reintegration. But there is a Quranic verse where the tree also emphasizes something of the descent. If all the trees in the earth were pens, and if the sea eked out by 7 seas more were ink, the words of God could not be written out to the end. The qalam, the celestial pen, the instrument through which the revelation is made. I mean, that's, of course, clearly linked with the idea of the tree. 1 second, darling. That's my daughter joining in the lecture, I think. The verse of the tree speaks of its branches in heaven. Here's to give you another example. The palmette in the margin is as near to a direct illustration as this art will allow. In other words, it is a reminder that the reading or chanting of the Quran is the virtual starting point of a limitless vibration, a wave that ultimately breaks on the shore of eternity. Another symbol which expresses both perfection and infinitude, and which is intimately, though not apparently, related to the tree, is the rayed sun. I'll give you several examples here. So it's interesting here, for instance, the surah heading is simply just written in a different hand, but it doesn't have the sort of the same feature as some of the other surah headings. Now we're beginning to see, of course, various symbols that we've already discussed separately. So I can return back to that. Again and again, the Quran refers to itself as light, or as being radiant with light. Sometimes the symbolism of light is directly combined with that of the tree, as when a solar roundel figures inside the Surah Palmet. So you see here, the symbolism of the sun is captured at the center of the tree form. I'll give several examples of this. This again is the tree and the sun combined. What's interesting here is that the sun here also has a lotus, a pattern in it, which is sort of a borrowing from the Buddhist world. Sort of is like sort of nurun ala nur, so to speak. The palmet itself is rounded and rayed, and its lobe, well, let me just see. Sometimes the palmet itself is rounded and rayed. Here we go, let me just, with its lobe replaced by an outward pointing finial, as in this plate. So here the tree almost has disappeared. It's just the element of the sun stands in for the tree, but that final finial somehow evokes the tree back again. The revelation is not only a shining of light from the next world, but it also throws its light towards the next world by way of guidance. Nor can this reversal, reversed reintegrating light be separated from the soul's spiritual aspiration, which is likewise figured by everything that points to the beyond. I mean, I'll just leave it on there. But of course, there's so many Quranic pages, you find all sorts of little details which are pointing into the margin. Related to the tree is the Arabesque. So you can see the Arabesque patterns, especially here on the outer margins. Being venial rather than arboreal, the Arabesque does not by its nature point out a way, though it can give a clear indication of a tendency. Where it is a background for the script, it serves to heighten the effect of the letters as vehicles of the living word. Here, of course, we have Innahu la Qur'anun Kareem, sort of, which has a beautiful sort of Arabesque scrolling behind it. Moreover, as a portrayal of rhythm, by its constant repetition of the motifs, in particular format at regular intervals, it suggests rhythmic recitations which take place, we are told, not only on Earth, but throughout the degrees of the universe. It's wonderful to see these sort of repeating spirals here, like for instance, the 3 repeating spirals behind that Quranic verse. And in fact, Sheikh Isa, Frithjof Schuon, in several of his teachings refers very much to the idea of rhythm as being a key aspect of a journey back towards the divine, so to speak. So turning now to the idea of numbers and their geometric equivalents. 9 and 3, like the circle and the triangle, are worldwide symbols of heaven, their earthly complements being the number 4 and the square or rectangle. The rectangular setting of the Quranic text thus signifies the terrestrial state which has been penetrated by the revelation. It's wonderful to see sort of, so to speak, heaven captured in the rectangular frame of the world. And of course, all Qurans have this, even if they don't have the rectangular illumination. Even the very fact that the page is cut as a rectangle itself is part of that. I could just give a little aside here, which is that I was once talking with Sheikh Abu Bakr, and he mentioned that the number 13, which is people refer to as an unlucky number. He said possibly the reason for that is it's really the first in the number series that has no great meaning of any kind. All the other numbers have great significance of one kind or another. But for instance, the number 5 itself represents man. I mean, we mentioned here the number 3 and number 9. Number 4 represents the world. 5 is, in fact, the number 5 also is very beautiful because is it called the pentangle, Sidi Taimur? Where you draw a 5-figured circle, which looks like a sort of star. But in fact, that's actually the symbol of a man. Is that if you draw it with the star pointing upwards, the upward pointing star is like the head, and then the 2 arms stretched aside, and the 2 legs. And in fact, the pentangle also contains the proportion of the golden mean. But it's not the number 5 that's quintessentially man. The quintessential man is number 6. And which is represented, but in fact we'll come. Martin Lings talks about that later, and we'll come to that. But if I go through the numbers, I can think of 7 clearly is associated with heaven. 8 is like a bridge between earth and heaven. The number 10 is of course another number for man, his 2 hands, and also it corresponds to the triangular number. 1 + 2 + 3 + 4, which was sort of a sacred thing for the Pythagoreans. The number 11, of course, in Islam is particularly miraculous, as it's the number that corresponds in Abjad numerology to the word huwa. And there's a wonderful thing that was pointed out to me some years ago, which is so miraculous, because when one says huwa Allah, in a certain sense, one's actually making a mathematically rigorous statement, because huwa is the number 11. Allah is 66. That's 1 plus 30 plus 30 plus 5. But so of course 11 can multiply by 6 to arrive at 66. But in fact, the number 11 has embedded within it the idea of 66, because if you add 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 all the way up to 11, the sum of those numbers leads to 66. So when you say Hu Allah, you say yes, 11 is 66 in a certain roundabout way. Of course, the number 19 is yes, I've got here the number 12. Of course, one thinks of with the zodiac, and of course, I'd recommend anyone to look at Keith Critchlow's book on Islamic geometry. But it has the most wonderful first few pages. The first page is just simply a dot on a page, and then the next, which represents 1. Then the next, you turn the page, and then the dot is drawn out into a line. So the line represents 2. And then you turn the page again, and then the line rotating around one end then traces out a circle. And then you turn the page again, and you find that circle can have 6 circles placed around it. So the number 6, again, there is the idea of prophecy, so to speak. And it also ties in with the idea of God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But then if you continue that analogy further, beyond the 6, you arrive at 12 circles around the 6. And if you add those all together, 12 and 6 and 1, you end up with 19, which is again one of these wonderful magical numbers, which has all sorts of Islamic resonances. And of course, the basmala is made of 13 letters, and so on and so forth. And there's a tradition that heaven and hell have 19 gates, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I think I better not go on a diversion of my own there. However paradoxical it may seem. Oh, thank you, darling. Shukran. So however paradoxical it may seem, illumination, being there to remind us of the hidden book, has an overall function of majesty in relation to the beauty of the text. This holds good even when the illumination is at its most beautiful and when the text is written in a particularly majestic style. So let me give you, there's an example of a particularly majestic script. And another such example. And then I selected a couple of examples of particularly beautiful scripts, which sort of corresponds more with the sort of nature of the text as such. By the middle of the 4th or 10th century, gold, of course, is the color par excellence that's used in representing the Quran and for illumination and representing light. But by the 4th or 10th century, blue had come to have a precedence over green and red as alternative colors that were used in the Quran, especially in the East. In the East, one moment. In the East, blue was raised almost to the level of gold. It was raised to the level of parity with gold, which you can see in this example. There's another example of blue and gold sort of in parity with each other. But in the Islamic West, gold retained its original supremacy, with blue lying in second place. So one can see the sort of blue in the background and sort of edging some of the details. And of course, that's actually an Eastern early Kufic. Let me go back to here. Blue is the color of the infinite, which is identical with mercy. For my mercy embraceth all things. The great symbol of this infinitude is the all-surrounding sky. The relevant divine name, Ar-Rahman, the first of the two names of mercy, has been translated the infinitely good, for it expresses the essential roots of mercy. At this level, mercy, revelation, and religion are all one. Closely related to Ar-Rahman is the name Al-Muhit, the all-embracing, and by extension, the word Muhit also means ocean. In fact, I remember in our previous talk, we mentioned this idea of how my mercy embraceth all things. In a way, you could see that the edging of blue as the last line of color in many manuscripts echoes that idea, because blue has the final say and surrounds everything with its color. As a symbol of infinite mercy, the sea is, in fact, second only to the sky itself, whose color it takes on and assimilates. one has the impression of an unwritten law that blue must have the last word. If blue liberates by infinitude, gold liberates because, like the sun, it is a symbol of the spirit and therefore virtually transcends the whole world of forms. Gold, by its very nature, escapes from form to the point that a calligrapher writing in gold has to outline his letters with black in order to make them formally effective. There's an example of that here. And in this text as well, because if you could imagine this text written without outlining, the gold would be almost lost. I'm afraid you'll have to sort of turn your heads to look at that. I don't know how to get that picture to come around the right way. But this is a wonderful example, in fact. If you look at this text, the artist is actually, this is a Rehan script, and the script is written in gold, but then the tashkil is done in blue. And there's these wonderful little details where the blue has been dropped as like, if you look inside the ta marbuta of the word mutahhara, for instance, the illuminators painted in blue into the ta marbutas and certain other areas. Sometimes you find that in the letter mim, for instance. I think in the fa on the top left-hand side as well. As the color of light, gold is like yellow, intrinsically a symbol of knowledge. Extrinsically, it means, actually, let me go back to a page where you can be looking. Extrinsically, it means teaching or manifestation. Blue in the presence of gold is therefore mercy inclined to reveal itself. And Sheikh Abubakr points out a beautiful verse from the Surah Al-Rahman. The infinitely good taught the Quran. A'udhu billahi minash shaitan rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran. And in fact, he points out, if you think that the word Ar-Rahman can be equated to the color blue, and taught encapsulates the idea of teaching or manifestation, and that's gold. So you could say that that verse in itself encapsulates, in a way, the idea of blue and gold. And Sheikh Abubakr also points out that, in a certain sense, the Quranic text you can think of as being green, as because in a certain sense you could say, why isn't the color green the predominant color for the Quran? But you could say it's the text that takes that idea, because gold or yellow and blue together would meld together to make green. So this sentence, Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran, in a way sums up blue, gold, and green, so to speak. You can think of it in those terms. Oh, actually, I should go back to the color because I'm not talking about this. In the triple domain of primary color, perfect balance cannot come by two, but only by three. But in a certain sense, the Islamic artist is not looking for balance. Gold has the exaltation to balance the depth of blue, but not being the hot color, its mere warmth does not level out the coldness of blue. The resulting overall coolness does much to contribute to the total effect of holiness. And Sheikh Abubakr alludes to this expression in Arabic, al-qurratul ayn, the coolness of the eye, to mean delight, and the joys of paradise summed up in that expression. Al-qurratul ayn fi salah, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. Well, I shall now turn to the next. If you just excuse me 1 second. Bismillah.
Yes, yes.
اللهم لك صمت وعلى نعمتك أفطرت. Bismillah. So the question might be formulated: what is the ideal Quranic script? On condition that the word ideal be understood in its original Platonic sense. And since an idea is a transcendent synthesis whose aspects cannot all be reflected in one earthly symbol, the answer to the question is necessarily a plural one. I mean, one could, in a certain sense, thinking ahead to the talk on evolution, one can think of like a divine archetype, let's say, of a creature like a cat. But then, of course, you could say, well, what is the ideal cat? But then there are many kinds of cats, you know, and all the different variations. You can't sum up cat with just one single instance of a cat. Each great style of Quran calligraphy is a part answer to this question. What qualities, through what's, now one could ask, what are the different qualities that different scripts represent? And this is really a much more difficult question, but Sheikh Al-Baq still goes on to actually give an answer to some extent to this. So let's begin by looking at Kufic. Kufic reached its fullness the last half of the 2nd century. If a distinction is to be made between writing and drawing, the original Kufic, or the Kufi, is the nearest to drawing of all the Arabic scripts. Oh, thank you. I have. It cannot be called static, for its marked horizontal strokes, often very elongated, give it momentum. In fact, this is a better example for the long, elongated strokes here. But this great procession of hieroglyphs, some simple and others compounded of more than one element, may be said to have nonetheless a certain fixity suggestive of inevitable necessity, as if its letters were intended to express the decisiveness of the divine decree from which the revelation sprang, or as if to proclaim that the message they bear is irrevocable and immutable. At the same time, there is something solemnly cryptic and reserved about this style, which seems to withhold more than it gives, as if fearful of divulging secrets, and which suggests a message that is still not fully revealed, a message which still partly clings to its own unrevealed and inviolable archetype, which is inscribed in heaven on the guarded tablet. Particularly significant is the gradual spelling out of words, letter by letter. Some letters positioned remarkably far from each other, as if to warn that the contents are too tremendous to be lightly and easily unfolded. If we sent down this Quran upon a mountain, thou wouldst have seen it lying prostrate in humility, rent asunder through fear of God. In fact, if you look at this, thinking to look at this as an example. For instance, here actually, let's see. Here you've got either, and then da'a. What's interesting in the Kufic script, you can sometimes break up the word over different lines as well. So the dal here on the top left is the same word as da'akum. So idha da'akum. But you can see what Sheikh Al-Baq means by the way there's this sort of great spacing between letters. And even the way this letter is sort of extended out, sort of, there's no reason for this extension per se. So the alayhi, this is the word alayhi. Of course, it's and these are some of the examples of the way Kufic will compound different letters all together. I can't read that letter. So, Inna alladhina inda rabbika la yastakbiruna an ibadatihi. Wa yusabbihunahu wa lahu yasjudun. But you can see when I was reading this, it's a bit problematic. There's a red dot here, which actually doesn't belong here. It's obviously been transferred from the opposite page. Because this is la yusabbihuna. This looks like la yastakbirun. So this is ta. There should be a dot above here, if anything. This is not a kasra, because the dot underneath the line would suggest kasra. But that's been transferred from the opposite page. In its later developments, the Kufi moved in the direction of cursive scripts and became much easier to read. I mean, I think all of you could be able to read this, even though it looks, it has the perfume of that earlier Kufic, but it's fairly straightforward to read. Yamutu fiha wa la yahya. قد أفلح من تزكى. Oh, and unfortunately, this comes down the other way. But again, you can see that's really quite legible in modern terms. Then there's the Kufic lettering. Of course, this script is divided between the East and the West. So the Kufic in the East was then replaced by other cursive hands. But actually in the Western Islamic world, the Kufic developed into its own cursive form. So I'll give you some examples.
So then, do you think we can also start taking some questions at some point soon?
You can jump in with any questions as you like.
So yes. That is for our audience online here at Zoom. If anybody has a question, they can raise hand. Either there's an icon at the bottom.
Oh, that gives me time for another date then.
Please, you can take a break. I mean, if you want to.
No.
Somebody asked on Facebook as to why didn't they use other colors. I think you explained it quite well.
They do, and in fact, amongst all the different Qurans one's seen libraries, I mean, there are the occasional Qurans that use rather unusual colors even, but they're few and far between. They more rank as experiments which have sort of failed and then been abandoned. But but their symbolic value is what's so important. You know, but there are you do get examples. If I put one example here.
So
in the Islamic West, sometimes red does replace the predominance of the blue. So it's not a totally universal rule about blue and gold, but red can sometimes. And red is often present in green. Often you will find traces of green here and there.
Bilal has a question. He's raised his hand. Yes, Bilal Sahab. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. It's quite all-encompassing.
Well, I'm glad to say it's not my words. And so it's really, I can count on...
Both with the visual representation.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to ask about some of the new trends in Islamic calligraphy.
Yes.
I'm seeing people who are really steeped in the classical tradition. So they've been carrying the lineage with them. And
Yes.
now they really utilizing modern forms of art and technology to give a new representation to this art form. Do you think that has a scope to maybe open up new layers of understanding, or do you think it's reductionist and is indicative of the times we're in?
Well, no, one thing I would say, I mean, one marvelous example of what you're mentioning is there's a Spanish faqira, Garcia, I forget her name, but...
Garcia Nur, yes, I know her.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. I mean, when I saw some of her work, I was absolutely spellbound in some examples of her work. And I would say, I mean, to my untrained eye, I have had the privilege of looking at some of these greatest manuscripts in the different libraries all over the world. And in some of her writing, I think she really ranks among some of the greatest work that I've ever seen. But that's just my personal opinion. I would have loved to have known what Sheikh Obaid would have made of some of her work. But I think the Sheikh Obaid mentioned over and over that actually the traditional art of calligraphy is still very strong. The real trouble in the Islamic world has been the falling away of illumination. But there is some some quite good attempts at illumination here and there, but it's really but even in if you notice in Sheikh Obaid's book, there's hardly any examples of Qurans from the last few centuries because they don't really come up to his exacting standards. Although by many other people's standards today, they would be sort of masterpieces, he wouldn't rank them as the very highest of the examples of Islamic art, although they're still sort of quite... But in the Islamic West, strangely, and there's an example we'll come to at the end of this talk, there were some very great examples of illumination still surviving. So in Maghribi Qurans, you get quite impressive illumination that matches the stature of the writing up till quite recently. And it would be wonderful if one could revive that art. But I think once you take the Quranic calligraphy out of somebody's hand and you do it as in a mechanical way, like using a computer and whatever, then I think it's a kind of very slippery and dangerous road. Funny enough, it's a road that I traveled myself once. It has sort of interesting... I was very fascinated by the Ibn Suhrawardi Muhaqqaq script, and there's only like 4 or 5 volumes of that exist. And with the calligrapher, Allah Yarhamu, Bahish Andari, we sat down and we actually digitized the outline of all the letters using Illustrator. And it was a very interesting exercise. I mean, we thought we could then try and rebuild some of the missing ajza for that mushaf. But it's not really satisfying. I mean, one has to have... Well, one has to have that. Sorry.
I was just saying that there's Aqila Shirazi also wants to ask a question.
Yes, correct.
There's a text which I'll read after that.
But just to finish what I'm saying, it was... Yes, I hope I've answered your question. I think there's great modern silsilas that teach calligraphy, and which is still alive, both in East and West. And in fact, there's an Islamic calligraphy school that was set up by a friend of ours in Cairo, Faisal Shaabi, and it's really quite an impressive thing he's done. And he's brought people from all over the Islamic world to train there with masters that he's brought together near Al Hussein Mosque, actually.
Yes,
So,
thank you very much. I also had in mind when I was asking that, I don't know if you come across the works of Surya, because she again used to practice and teach, and she was steeped in the classical tradition, and that's how she was taught. And now she's doing a lot of work which is quite groundbreaking in many ways, and using kind of holograms and using computational programming to really give a new spin on an old art form. So Jazakallah for your time. Thank you.
Well, no, but in fact, what you just mentioned there, I would like to comment on. Just in passing, her work, but I would say that I think Martin would have been almost horrified to hear what you're saying. I mean, because in a certain sense, one isn't interested on a new spin. A new spin on an art form is exactly what one doesn't want. That's exactly what tradition isn't. What one wants is the same old perfected forms which have been granted by heaven. It's not for us to go and explore. We're not living in an age where our own ijtihad can bring up something of worth that can actually match some of the great past masters, really. I think what to sort of go off on sort of holographic and sort of experimental, it's all very well and good. That's really like sort of modern art in a sort of we're sort of blending that with Islamic calligraphy, and I must say my own predilections don't go in that direction at all. So yes, so if I could take the other question.
Atila, you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you, Sir Temu. I want to ask about the specific shape of rectangle, which you mentioned in the beginning. You said about the shape of rectangle. What is the significance, or what is the secretness behind the rectangular shape?
Well,
because yes, excuse me, all the text I feel in the book, the Quranic, the specific shapes are in rectangular, while they are the rectangular shape or you can say the horizontal, but all text in the rectangular. So my question is the specific of the any secretness behind this, or
no. If I could just cut in there, which is basically it's simply because if you present a page of any kind of page for a book, it'll either be a square format or some kind of rectangle. Whether horizontal or vertical. But the important point that Martin Lings was making is that all such forms are, so to speak, impressed with the number 4. Because it's a square or rectangle has 4 sides or 4 corners. And so symbolically, the number 4 corresponds to the world. When one looks at a Quran manuscript, one's aware simply by holding a rectangular object and seeing the rectangular or square representation of the text on the page, you're aware that you're in the world, but then you're aware of a sacred presence in that world. And so, and especially with these illuminated elements we've been talking about, there's this, and the margin, there's this sort of sense that you can escape from the world back to paradise. So in a sense, the white space around the text represents the sort of paradisal or heavenly domain.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. I could give a footnote to that, which is that the Islamic world, of course, is very aware of what we in modern day terms called A numbers. There's only one ratio of paper that you can actually fold, and it will give you the same shape as itself again. So, I mean, if I hold this, for instance, on the screen there, that's an A-size paper. But if I fold it in half and I bring it closer to the screen, you see it's exactly the same ratio, and I can fold it as many times as I want, and I still end up being the same shape. And of course, paper was a very precious resource in the past, and people realized that in manufacturing paper, you could, if you produce it in these proportions, you could then fold it and cut it and bind it into books of different sizes using the same material without wastage. So, you know, the A format has a very special, and I'm sure if one looked into it, it most probably has a spiritual significance as well, a little bit like the golden mean ratio, you know. So, but there's only one ratio of height and width that corresponds to this magical A number, so to speak. But Siri, should we press on? Because I'm worried that we might miss, or should we keep the other half of the talk for our next meeting?
We could.
I mean, how are we doing for time?
I think we finished up our time, so
Yes.
might be a good idea to continue it.
Yes.
In the next.
All right. So next time we'll do part 2, and part 2 is about as long as this part.
All right, that's very nice.
Yes.
So maybe we could take one last question if anybody has a comment or a question. Otherwise, we would like to thank all the participants, and especially Sidi Mustafa, who spoke to us during his fast. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It concentrated the mind.
There's one interesting question from Iram Gul.
Yes.
Iram, why don't you ask yourself?
Yes, please go ahead. I'd love to hear. What is their name? Iram or
Gul.
Gul, that's the surname?
Basically, she's saying that what's the source of deciding, let's say, about gold, color, and blue? Your mic is open. Please go ahead, Iram. Bismillah.
Thank you, sir. I want to know that do this use of color is attributed to one's spiritual experience, or these represent some transcendental expression? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question fully, but basically it's you know the symbolism of things. That, you know, gold has its own nature, and it's always been associated with you know, the idea of the sun. I mean, the sun is a great symbol of the spirit. You know, and then of course there's there's symbolisms within the you know, the 3 primary colors, you know, red, yellow, and blue. And in fact, Sheikh Abu Bakr has written the most wonderful essay on the symbolism of the primary colors. I forget where it's published, but it's in a certain sense these colors. They correspond to almost like, you could say that, like the Trinity in Christianity. You say the Father corresponds to red, the Son to yellow, and the Holy Spirit to blue. Of course, blue also is associated with the Blessed Virgin, and the idea of mercy and is very closely tied up with the color blue. As Sheikh Obak was trying to point out in what he was saying, you know, the name Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, excuse me, and Al-Muhit, they have this, there's this sort of all-encompassing mercy. And Al-Muhit in Arabic also means the sea or the ocean. So there's a kind of direct link between and the sky is a symbol of mercy. The way where, I mean, imagine if when we looked up there was no sky and all we saw during the day was the deep, frightening, empty depth of black space. It would be quite alarming. But in fact, Providence has organized it so that when we look up at the sky, instead of feeling a sense of vertigo and loss, we have this wonderful sense of being embraced. And I mean, it's not by chance that we seem to think of, as heaven as being above, and the sky is a very natural symbol for us as human beings to be able to associate with God and the transcendent and God's mercy. The fact that rain comes down from the sky, again, this is the place where mercy starts and comes down to us. In a way, modern people don't think in terms of symbolism of color and materials. I remember some years ago talking with you, Sidi Taimur, and saying that you're mentioning how in Pakistan, some people will wear certain gemstones of certain colors, and and different stones have different sort of qualities that people appreciate, and they're good for health, or they're good for love, or so traditional people in the past thought very carefully about what colors meant, what the primary colors meant, what different stones meant. And of course, the preciousness of gold itself is somehow very important here. So in a way, the illuminator is gathering together the greatest resources that nature has provided in terms of color and material, and then incorporated them into something that can then be a sort of means by which we can be drawn back towards heaven. Interesting enough, blue is a very difficult blue color to produce well. And there's very few very great compounds that produce wonderful color blues. And there's a mountain in, I think it's Afghanistan, that has the only kind of blue that exists of a certain, forget what it's called. And these stones were traded. It's extraordinary. You find stone, this blue stone coming from these mines in Afghanistan all the way to ancient Egypt, 1,000 or 2,000 years BC. So people really highly prized colors and the materials that could bring such colors. I'm sorry.